There is a question that haunts every civilization that has ever risen and collapsed into dust. It is not asked loudly, it is asked in silence in the hours before dawn, when the mind turns toward ruins it cannot explain and losses it cannot reverse. The question is this: can something that has completely died ever truly live again? Not recovered, not rebuilt, not remembered, truly alive? Most of the time, the answer that history gives is no. Empires fall and do not return. Languages die and are not spoken again. Peoples are scattered and never reassemble. The bones of the past bleach under open skies, and the world moves on, indifferent to what was lost. But there is a valley in this ancient record that refuses that answer. A valley where the bones were not merely old, they were dry, completely stripped of everything that once made them living. And into that valley walked a prophet who had already seen fire consume the city he loved, who had watched the temple of the living God reduced to rubble, who had witnessed an entire civilization dragged away in chains. He had every reason to believe the story was over. And yet, something spoke. What happens in that valley is either the most extraordinary display of sovereign power in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, or it is a beautiful metaphor for something that cannot actually occur. The ancient text does not give you the luxury of choosing one interpretation comfortably. It forces you to stand inside the vision itself, to hear the rattling, to watch the sinews stretch across hollow frames, and to ask what you actually believe about the nature of life, death, and divine authority over both. This is not a story about optimism. It is not a motivational vision dressed in ancient language. It is something far older, far stranger, and far more demanding than that. Prepare yourself to stand in a valley of bones and discover why the most terrifying sound in Scripture is the sound of the dead beginning to move. There are moments in the biblical record where God does not speak from a mountain, does not appear in a burning bush, does not send an angel with a drawn sword. There are moments where God takes a man by the hand, or perhaps by something deeper than the hand, by the Spirit itself, and carries him somewhere that no human being would willingly go. Ezekiel was that kind of man, a priest, a prophet, a man shaped by the rhythms of the temple, by the smell of incense and the sound of Levitical choirs. He had been born into a world where Jerusalem stood at the center of everything that mattered, not merely politically, not merely culturally, but cosmologically. Jerusalem was where heaven touched earth. The temple was where the presence of God made its dwelling among humanity. To Ezekiel, as to every believing Israelite of his generation, the destruction of that city was not simply a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe without precedent. The year was approximately 597 before the Common Era, though the precise calendar matters less than the weight of what had already happened. Babylon, that massive machine-like empire of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, had already swept through Judah once, carrying away the first wave of captives, including Ezekiel himself. He was among the exiles at Tel Abib, beside the Chebar River, in a land that was not his, under a sky that felt wrong, surrounded by people who were slowly losing their grip on who they were. Picture that landscape. Flat river plains stretching to every horizon, irrigation canals cutting through rich black soil, ziggurat towers rising in the distance, monuments to gods with names that meant nothing to an Israelite child, gods served by elaborate priesthoods, by cities that never seemed to sleep, by an administrative apparatus so vast and efficient it could move entire nations the way a man moves furniture. This was Babylon. Not the vague metaphor that later generations would make of the name, the actual city, the actual empire, the actual smell of foreign incense on foreign air. And among the displaced, among the grieving, among those who sat down by the rivers and wept, was a man who would not stop hearing from heaven. Ezekiel's prophetic ministry was not gentle. It was not reassuring in the conventional sense. He was asked to perform strange enacted parables, to lie on his side for days, to cook bread over unusual fuel, to shave his head and divide the hair into thirds. He was shown visions of such overwhelming complexity and fire that later generations would debate whether young men should be permitted to read his opening chapters without supervision. He was told, in a moment of almost unbearable cruelty, that his wife, the delight of his eyes, as the text puts it, would die, and that he would not be permitted to mourn her publicly because her death would mirror what God was doing to the temple, and Israel had long since forfeited the right to weep over what its own sins had destroyed. This is the man. Remember him. Because the valley he is about to enter is not a vision given to someone comfortable, someone naive, someone who still believes the universe is organized around human convenience. It is given to a man who has already been stripped over and over of every natural consolation, a man who understands in his body and his spirit what total loss actually feels like. The hand of the Lord was upon him. That phrase, in Hebrew, the hand of the Lord, signals in the prophetic literature a transport of some kind, a carrying away of the spirit into a space between the ordinary and the unbearable. Ezekiel is brought out by the Spirit of God and set down in the middle of a valley. And the valley, the text is careful here, almost clinical in its specificity, the valley was full of bones, not a few bones, not scattered remnants, full. And the text adds a detail that functions as a kind of theological diagnosis. The bones were very dry. This is not the battlefield of a recent conflict, where the bodies still hold some moisture of recent death, where the smell of decomposition still signals that something living has only just ceased to be. This is a place of total, advanced, completed death. The sun has done its work completely. Time has done its work completely. Whatever these people were, and they were clearly many, clearly once a people of significance, they are now indistinguishable from the dust around them, except that they have not yet become dust. They are the last stage before erasure, past grief, past burial, past even the dignity of mourning, simply bones, dry, many, scattered. God walks Ezekiel among them. This is important. He does not show him the valley from a distance. He causes him to pass among them, to see them from the inside, to understand the scale and the completeness of what he is looking at. This is not a theological concept to be contemplated abstractly. This is a physical reality to be walked through, bone by bone, row by row, field by field. And then God asks what may be the most profound question in the entire prophetic literature. Can these bones live? The question is not rhetorical in the ordinary sense. It is not asked to produce an obvious answer. It is asked to locate the prophet's faith, to find its edges, to discover where the boundary of his belief in divine power actually sits. Because the natural answer, the answer of common sense, of grief, of historical experience, is no. The bones are dry, the people are gone, the nation is scattered, the temple is ash. The story is over. Ezekiel does not say no, but he also does not say yes. He says, Lord God, you know. And that answer, that act of refusing to place a ceiling on divine capacity, while also refusing to manufacture a confidence he does not fully feel, that answer is itself a kind of faith. Not triumphant faith, not the faith of a man who has never doubted. The faith of a man who has seen enough of God to know that certainty of outcome is not his to hold, but certainty of sovereignty is. Then comes the command. Prophesy to these bones. Speak to them. Tell them to hear the word of the Lord. Consider the strangeness of this instruction. Ezekiel is being asked to preach to the dead. Not to a congregation, however small or discouraged, not to the exiles, however broken, to bones, dry bones, a landscape of finality. He is being asked to treat corpses as an audience, to speak into a silence so complete it mocks the very act of speaking, and yet this is the moment where the vision pivots from desolation to something that has no natural category. He prophesies, and as he speaks there is a noise, a rattling, and bone begins to come to bone. The Hebrew here is precise and strange. It does not say the bones assembled themselves in an orderly manner. It says they came together, bone to its bone, as if each fragment had a memory of where it belonged, as if each rib and femur and finger joint retained some deep structural knowledge of the body it once inhabited. The vision is not of random reassembly. It is of recognition, of belonging, of restoration that knows what it is restoring, and then sinew, flesh, skin, The bodies are rebuilt from the inside out, layer by layer, with the kind of biological precision that would only become comprehensible to later generations who understood anatomy and tissue and the architecture of the human form. The valley that had been a landscape of death becomes something stranger still, a landscape of completed, formed, silent human bodies. But here is the tension. Here is the moment the vision refuses to become merely spectacular. For when the bodies are complete, when every bone has found its partner, when every frame is covered in flesh, they do not breathe. They lie there, perfectly formed, utterly still. A valley of corpses instead of a valley of bones. Different, but not yet alive. What Ezekiel is seeing is the limit of physical reconstruction. A body can be assembled, structure can be restored. The outer form of a people, the demographic presence, the territorial boundaries, the institutional arrangements, all of these can be reconstituted without what they most essentially require: breath, spirit, the animating presence without which all form is only more sophisticated dust. And so the command comes again: prophesy. This time not to the bones but to the breath, to the ruach, the Hebrew word that carries simultaneously the meanings of wind, breath, and spirit. The instruction is to call the breath from the four winds of the earth, from every direction, from the whole compass of heaven, and breathe it into these slain, the four winds. It is worth pausing here because this detail is not decorative. In the ancient cosmology that shaped biblical language, the four winds represented totality, the complete reach of the world. Nothing excluded, nothing withheld. What God is describing is not a partial restoration, not a regional recovery, not the return of a remnant that has stayed close enough to the point of origin. He is describing a gathering from everywhere, a reconstitution of something scattered to every corner of the earth. The breath enters, the bodies rise, not one, not a few, not a representative sample, an exceedingly great army. The valley that had been silent fills with the sound of an army standing on its feet, and the theological statement embedded in that image is almost violent in its force. What looked like the absolute end was not the absolute end. What appeared to be beyond the reach of restoration was not beyond the reach of the God who defines the limits of the possible. And then God speaks the interpretation. Because this is not simply a miracle for its own sake. This is a parable with an address. The bones, God tells Ezekiel, are the whole house of Israel. They are the people who have been saying in the camps beside the Babylonian rivers, in the markets of a foreign city, in the silence of every night away from home, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely. That last phrase, and cut off completely, is the theological diagnosis beneath the vision, not wounded, not weakened, not in need of repair. Cut off, as if the relationship itself has been severed, as if the covenant has been nullified by catastrophe, as if exile is not a condition to be endured, but a verdict to be accepted as final. The valley of dry bones is God's answer to that verdict. And to understand the full weight of that answer, it is necessary to understand what had brought the nation to this condition in the first place. Because the exile did not arrive without warning. It did not descend from a clear sky on an innocent people. It was the culmination of a process of spiritual deterioration that stretched back centuries, a slow unraveling that had been documented, lamented, and warned against by prophet after prophet, generation after generation, with a consistency that makes the ultimate collapse not a surprise, but a long-delayed inevitability. The pattern had begun almost as soon as the promised land had been settled. The covenant at Sinai had been explicit: loyalty to the God who brought them out of Egypt, rejection of the gods of the surrounding nations, justice for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, Sabbath rest for the land and the laborer. These were not merely ritual requirements. They were the structural principles of a society built on a different foundation than every other society in the ancient world. They were the expression of a worldview that said the powerful do not consume the weak, that the earth does not belong to its occupants to exploit without limit, that history has a moral architecture that will eventually become visible. But the surrounding world offered something else. It offered the comfortable religion of the Baals, local fertility deities whose worship required nothing more than participation in agricultural cycles, whose priesthoods did not challenge the powerful, whose rituals could be accommodated alongside the worship of the God of Israel without apparent conflict. The erosion was gradual, a high place here, a sacred pole there. The language of Yahweh worship retained while the substance drained away. Kings who did evil in the sight of the Lord, that recurring phrase in the books of Kings, and the people who followed them, not because they were forced to, but because the alternative required more than they were willing to give. By the time of the later monarchy, the deterioration had moved past private compromise into institutional corruption. Priests who had accommodated the worship of foreign gods within the temple precincts. Prophets who had made a profession of telling rulers what they wanted to hear. Merchants who exploited the poor through systems of debt and false weights. Courts that administered a justice shaped by wealth rather than Torah. Nobles who accumulated land at the expense of subsistence farmers. A city that looked from the outside like a center of Yahweh worship and functioned from the inside like any other ancient Near Eastern political economy in which the religious apparatus served the interests of power. The prophets had seen it clearly. Isaiah had spoken of a city of harlotry. Jeremiah had walked through the temple courts and declared that the people had made what should have been a house of prayer into a den of robbers. Not meaning ordinary theft, but the systemic robbery of those with no recourse, sanctified by religious performance. Amos had described a nation that offered elaborate sacrifices while selling the needy for the price of sandals, that observed religious festivals while tilting the scales of trade. Hosea had spoken of unfaithfulness not as a moral metaphor, but as a lived reality. A people that had given its loyalty, its reverence, its ultimate trust, not to the God of the covenant, but to the powers and systems and gods that seemed more immediately useful. And through it all, the warnings, prophet after prophet, vision after vision, generation after generation. Return. The door is still open. The covenant still holds. The catastrophe is not yet. Come back before the threshold is crossed. The threshold was crossed. Jerusalem fell, the temple burned, the ark disappeared into the silence of history, the priests were taken in chains to Babylon, the royal line was broken, the administrative structures that had organized Israelite life for centuries, the tribes, the land assignments, the festival calendar, the sacrificial system, all of it was torn away, and what remained was a people without a country, without a temple, without a king, sitting beside foreign rivers and asking whether the God they had finally and catastrophically lost their hold on still knew their names. This is the world into which the Valley of Bones speaks, because what Ezekiel sees in that vision is not merely a promise of physical return to a geographic territory, though it includes that. It is a revelation of something about the nature of the God Israel had been slow to believe was actually as serious as the covenant claimed. A God who does not simply remove his presence from those who reject it, declare the relationship terminated, and move on to more responsive partners. A God whose commitment to this people was not conditional on their performance in the way that human commitments are conditional. A God who had watched the bones become dry, who had allowed the dryness as the inevitable consequence of a people who had chosen death in 1,000 small increments across generations, and who was now, in the very depths of the ruin, speaking resurrection. Not restoration to what it had been before, because what it had been before was the gradual accumulation of failures that produced the ruin. Something different, something new, a restored people with restored hearts, as an earlier Ezekiel vision had put it, hearts of flesh where there had been hearts of stone, a spirit placed within them that would cause them to walk in the divine statutes, not from external compulsion, but from internal transformation. The bones lived, not because they deserved to live, not because the dryness had been a misunderstanding, not because the catastrophe had been an overreaction, not because the covenant had not truly been violated. They lived because the God who defines the boundary between the possible and the impossible had decided in his sovereignty and his covenant faithfulness that the story was not finished. History would bear this out. The Persian king Cyrus would eventually issue a decree allowing the exiles to return. The community would struggle back to a devastated land, rebuild under opposition, construct a second temple. Nothing like the glory of the first, enough to make the old men who had seen Solomon's temple weep at the comparison. And begin again, the slow work of trying to be what the covenant had always called them to be. The fullness of the vision would remain, as most prophetic visions do, partially unfulfilled, pointing towards something larger than any single historical moment, a horizon that continued to recede as each generation reached toward it. But the principle embedded in the valley stands independent of its specific historical fulfillment. It stands as a declaration about the relationship between divine patience and divine power, between the long silence of heaven and the sudden irreversible movement that breaks it. It stands as testimony that what looks from within the ruins like abandonment may be something else entirely. Something harder to name, but unmistakable when it arrives. The preparation of a people to receive a restoration they could not have received while still whole. There is a reason this vision has haunted every generation of believers who has encountered it. It speaks to something that is not merely national, not merely historical, not circumscribed by the specific circumstances of 6th century Judean exiles in Mesopotamia. It speaks to the experience of any community, any tradition, any person who has arrived at a point of complete collapse and discovered that complete collapse is, somehow, not the same as complete termination. The bones are dry, the valley is silent, the bones are very dry, and yet, the pattern the vision encodes is older than Ezekiel and has not become obsolete. Civilizations still move through the same spiral, from vitality to accommodation, to compromise, to corruption, to collapse, with enough variation in detail to give each generation the illusion that its situation is unique, and enough consistency in structure to make the recognition when it finally comes feel ancient. The idols change their names and shapes with every era. The altars are built from different materials. The priests wear different clothes and speak different languages. But the fundamental dynamic, the slow substitution of functional power for genuine devotion, the erosion of the standards that made a community worth preserving, the final stage where the corruption is so complete that even the language of resistance has been absorbed and neutralized. This dynamic does not require a Bronze Age setting to be legible. We know what valleys of dry bones look like. We have walked among them in our own time, in communities we grew up in traditions we inherited, in institutions that once carried something living and now carry only the architecture of what living looked like. We recognize the dryness. We have heard our own generation say, in one voice or another, our hope is gone, we are cut off, the story is over. The question God asked Ezekiel has not been retired. It is still being asked in every valley of every kind of ruin, to every person who has arrived at the place where the honest answer seems to be no, and who is being asked, despite everything against everything, to prophesy anyway, to speak into silence, to address what appears to be a final absence. To trust that the breath comes from directions we cannot see, that restoration moves by its own logic and according to its own calendar, that dry bones have a memory of what they were and a capacity for what they could be, and that the God who walked a prophet through a valley of death did not do so to confirm the verdict of finality, but to overturn it. The bones rattled. They found each other. The flesh returned. The breath came, and an exceedingly great army stood upon its feet. If this exploration has stirred something in you, if you found yourself standing in that valley, hearing the rattling, watching what seemed finished begin to rise, stay with us, subscribe, and keep walking through Scripture with clarity and awe.